do it. Okay,
Oh,
go.
there we go. All right, so we can get started. So I found bits and pieces of sort of fundamentals slides from our old electrophysiology or neurophysiology lab course, and I, fancied them up a little bit. There is a very basic one that nevertheless may be useful for some of you because we never really formally discussed like what noise and interference is and how to deal with it and things like that. I mean, you kind of know what to do, but you may not know why. And then there is a second one that I want to do today, which is about digitizing our signals, right? So this is part two, basically, even though you haven't heard part one yet. So it's about how to get the best possible recordings. And so here's a nice Soma recording and extracellular recording. Very, very beautiful. And that is the result of doing all the rig debugging correctly, but you also then want to record it right. So in the bad old days, people displayed their amplifier signals on analog oscilloscopes and then literally, for example, took like Polaroids of the screen or had a little printer on the side. And then they started recording these things on
What is
magnetic.
a Polaroid? Fucking Chinese here.
You kids, do you know what a Polaroid camera is? Do you know what this is? This is a
Oh,
VHS tape. So people stored things on magnetic tape. That was one of the next to the last iteration of doing stuff like this. And then there's a funny thing that people still do in hospitals because this is an EKG recording here is just to continuously print out in these thermic printers, right? And basically wasting a lot of sort of these endless paper rolls. And nowadays, of course, we record everything with a computer and we use these gadgets, these digitizers or analog digital converters, and they come in different flavors. My lab has these CED 1401s. And then if you're in Horges or Ferzan's lab, you use one of these. This is the newer version. This is the older version. But for what we're going to talk about, it doesn't matter which one's which here. So the point of these is that you feed your amplifier signals into these. And by the way, none of the animations work. I'm a little worried here, but so you record with a computer basically. And what this means is that you take a continuous analog signal like you would display it on an old-fashioned analog oscilloscope, and you have to record this as the digital signal, which means it's discrete samples, discrete X, Y values, right? And that means you have to worry about two things. One is the time resolution. So how many discrete X values per time you take, like how often do you take a sample of where your voltage trace is? And the other one is how many discrete Y values, that's the voltage resolution or bit depth. So basically, how many discrete voltage values represent your signal. And that is something that you probably all more familiar with in the context of digital images, because you see that every day on the computer. So the equivalent of the temporal resolution is the image resolution or pixel count, which is just a spatial resolution instead of a temporal one. Which basically is just, if you see this picture of this old man, you have to decide how many discrete pixels you use to represent that. And obviously, if you use more, you see more details. But at some point, you gotta max those out, right? So maybe at least on the screen that you're looking at it, you probably don't see much of a difference between
They look exactly the same to me on my phone.
all four of them.
All four of them.
Well, it was not intended for phone screens. And then the other thing that is part of sort of digital imaging and what we're doing is the bit depth, and it's also for images also called pixel depth or gray level resolution, which is in bit logic, right? So the smallest unit of information is a bit. So 1 bit means 2 to the power of 1, which means 2 gray values. So you can represent this old man's face in just black and white. 2-bit means 4 different values. 4-bit means 16 different values of the gray values. And again, maybe it's hard to see a difference between 4-bit and 8-bit, but 8-bit is the industry standard, right? So everything that you look at the internet, for example, is 8-bit, which means 256 gray values. If it's a color picture, it's just 3 different channels RGB that have that pixel depth. All right, so these are the 2 things that make up digital resolution. And if we go to our voltage traces, nothing is happening. Let's look at the time resolution first, which is represented as, or the thing that we adjust as the sampling rate. And we get some, so how many discrete X values should we take per unit of time? And we get some theoretical help for that from this guy, Harry Nyquist, whose theorem says that the discrete samples have to be at a rate of at least twice of what the maximum frequency of the signal is. That is often very misunderstood, and I explain why. It is nowhere near sufficient in its logic to what we need to do when we sample our traces. But I'll get to that. There is a practical everyday application of this, and the sort of like most obvious example is audio traces, right? So the human hearing range goes from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. So the maximum frequency we can hear is 20 kilohertz. That means, according to Nyquist, if you record them digitally, you should at least be twice at that sampling rate. And in fact, the standard for music recordings, at least for digital music recordings, is 44.1 kilohertz. For some reason, sound recordings in movies are at 48. I don't know why, but so it's a bit more than twice of what the maximum is, at least if you're young enough. There's probably few of us actually hear 20 kilohertz. Probably Holger Farzan and I are more down to like 12 or something like that by now.
I maxed at 10 now. I actually checked. So
At what?
10 kilo.
10
10
kilohertz. Jeez. Anyway.
Yeah.
So it is actually not a great way if you really want to capture high frequencies, which is one of the reasons the hipsters claim that vinyl records are a lot better than digital recordings and things like that. Although you'd have to be in the frequency. You have to be at an age where you actually can hear anything from that upper frequency range. But if we, and then of course you use MP3s and they have compression and they don't preserve everything anyway. All right, so if we look at the theory of it, let's just take a sinusoid, right? So we have a sine wave with an amplitude and a frequency. The frequency is 1 over that period here. And if we say we sample this with some sampling rate, and if we use a sampling rate that is actually lower than the signal frequency, so 2/3 of it, obviously we only capture a point every once in a while, and that's not really what we want to do. But there is another phenomenon here that if you connect these and then maybe do some spline interpolation, so you get something like a sine wave out of it, that sine wave actually has a frequency that is not in the signal. So you get artifactual frequencies out of that, which is an effect of undersampling in most cases, and it's called aliasing, right? So you have probably seen anti-aliasing filters and all of that. So if I go to exactly the same sampling rate as I have signal frequency, you don't get any signal at all, right? Because you always take a sample at the same phase of your signal. So that's not good enough. You could argue at least there you don't get aliasing, but so let's now go to Nyquist. So Nyquist says 2 times the signal frequency. If we do this, so this is still completely undersampling. If we go to the Nyquist minimum, in this case, we still don't see a signal. So was Nyquist wrong? No, he was not wrong. So the reason you don't see a signal here is that your sampling times are in phase with the zero crossings of that sine wave, right? If I phase shift this a little bit, now you get accurate information about the frequency of the signal. And if I do the phasing just right, that your sampling coincides with the maxima and the minima, then you get accurate information about both the frequency and the amplitude of the signal. So what Nyquist meant is 2 times is the absolute minimum, if everything else is right, that you can use to capture the amplitude and the frequency of a signal. Right? obviously, this isn't great. If we go to something like 2.3, which is more than the audio sampling is done at, but it's sort of like the rule of thumb for spatial frequency if you're a digital microscopist, which I used to be. Things like that. So you get good information. You get okay information about frequency and amplitude, but it's not perfect, right? It's just a matter of like you don't want huge files and all of that. But you have to keep in mind that this only talks about the maximum frequency. So if you have an image or if you have a piece of music, that has a whole wide frequency band. And for all lower frequency, it's probably totally fine, right? It's just at the extreme point for the maxima that you're not doing such a great job with like 2 point something. But we care about pretty fast signals, but let's just crank it up. So 5 times the signal frequency gets better, not perfect yet. 10 times gets even better. You could argue that, even sort of phase shift doesn't make too much of a difference there. 20 times seems perfect, and maybe everything up there may or may not be overkill. So so one more thing to say about these two digitizers. So you have to determine what the sampling rate is. That's done in the software. And it's a little different for the 1401s versus the Digidata board, because the 1401s allows you to split the master sampling clock between different channels. So what this means is that you can record different channels at different sampling frequencies, whereas the Digidata board doesn't allow you. So you need, if you have a signal that needs the one that has the highest frequencies in that, and you should sample as the highest rate, that sets your sampling rate, and you have to use it for even signals where that's not necessary. So you have either one sampling rate or you have channel by channel different sampling rates. Anyway,
one thing, if you go 2 generations back of the Digidata board, you could, but not different for every channel, but you had 2 sampling rates.
Oh,
so as they improved, they killed that function.
All right.
They.
So Jorge's point is everything used to be better. Anyway, so if we look at our signal, so it's this beautiful, this is one of Liz's recordings actually. So you have an intercellular soma recording and an extracellular nerve recording. I think this is PD probably here from the crab. We can look at what frequencies we're actually interested in, right? And the way to do this sort of eyeballometrically is, well, the fastest signals in these soma recordings are the spikes that are already kind of low pass filtered because they don't actually happen at the soma. But they are about maybe 10 at the range of 10 milliseconds long, which means the signal frequency that we're interested in is around 100 hertz, right? Whereas in the extracellular recordings, things go up and down twice, much faster. So let's say that's in the range of about a millisecond of these different phases of the extracellular potential. So that would correspond to a signal frequency of 1,000 hertz. It's not a precise way to do this because details of the waveform trajectory may be at higher frequencies and things like that, but it's a rule of thumb kind of thing. So if we sample those, and let's pretend that this is an analog trace, and then we put the samples on top of that. Let's start with a Nyquist minimum for the soma recording here. So that would mean 200 hertz, right? Twice the 100 hertz here. And if you do this, you see the same problem as before. If you get lucky with the phasing, you capture the peaks of these action potentials here, but in the later ones, you're out of phase and you actually lose amplitude. And then this one is complete gobbledygook, right? Because you're actually only at a fifth of the signal frequency with your sampling rate. So if I make these continuous ones, you see that this looks crap, even for the ones that actually capture the spike. And this is complete, like you lose most of the signals here. All right, let's go up to 5 times. It gets a little better, but you still have some problems here. This is still gobbledygook because we're only at half the signal frequency. So you see that the waveform really doesn't look very nice yet. We go to 10 times 1 kilohertz. It's getting all right for this one. You may lose some details. Definitely not good enough for the extracellular recordings. Yeah, this looks still a little scraggly here. So why not go to 50 times 5 kilohertz? Now we're cooking, right? So the intracellular waveform looks kind of okay. Still some problems with extracellular ones. You miss a little bit here, but this one looks actually kind of okay. But you never know. I'd always like you err on the side of safety. Let's go to 100 times here to 10 kilohertz. Then you really have nothing to complain about, nothing to worry about losing anything for the intracellular one. The extracellular one looks now pretty decent at 10 kilohertz. And you could make the same argument for the 10 kilohertz safety margin. If you want to do spike shape sorting or something like that, you want as much information as possible. So let's go to 20 hertz, which is total overkill for the intracellular recordings, but you know, still not completely unreasonable for the extracellular ones. So what I would suggest and what I do, if you can set the sampling rate separately, don't go below 5 kilohertz for the soma recordings, and don't go below 10 kilohertz for the extracellular recordings. You can probably get away, and you know, it depends on what you do, but why throw that out? We don't really have that much of a worry about file sizes anymore, which I should say that larger sampling rates, of course, mean larger file sizes, right? So roughly, if you double the sampling rate, you double the file size. Storage-wise, we don't have that much of a problem anymore, but data like file handling could become a problem. But I'd rather record shorter files than compromise on the resolution. There may be a difference. I didn't know this, but I thought ABF files were all using 32-bit Windows logic, basically. And Spike 2 had changed to 64-bit, but Farzan tells me that depends on what versions of pclamp you use or something. I don't know. Yeah. But what this means, 64-bit means that it vastly greater resource allocations in terms of processing power and memory, so much faster file handling. My rule of thumb for a classic STG experiment with, you know, 2 intracellulars and a couple of extracellulars was when it was 32-bit, never record more than 10-minute files. Nowadays, we easily do 20-minute files. If you Liz, you do much larger, and then I have to deal with her files that are like 300 megabytes or something like that. But it's not about storage. It's about like you want to analyze them and open them, and you know, then you sit there for a couple of minutes before it's open and things like that. I don't know what happens when you read the ABF files into MATLAB to analyze these, how the data handling then is if the files are too long or something like that. But so it's something to be somewhat aware of. Okay. All right. So ultimately, what this means is the sampling rate depends on what your signal is and what you're interested in, which feature of your signal you're interested in, right? In the same way as if you want to identify the face of this old man and see that this is, I don't know, Bob or something like that, it's fine at this lower resolution, right? You don't win anything by making the resolution higher. It's very clearly this dude, right? But if you're interested in more details and want to see, I don't know, details about the eyebrows here or something, then you win something when you increase the resolution. So it depends on the signal and what you actually want to get out of it. All right. So that was the time resolution. Let's talk about voltage resolution, which is a little more confusing for most people. So this is the bit depth, right? So how many discrete Y values should represent our signal? And here's the logic. If we have a sinusoid again, and now I don't care about the frequency anymore, but let's say I have a digitizer that has a dynamic range from, let's say, -5 to +5 volts here, and I have a sine wave that covers the entire dynamic range. I still have to decide. I actually don't, but we'll come to that. I could decide what bit rate I'm going to use. And I could use 1 bit, which is of course silly because that's only 2 values, right? So it gives me this waveform here. It's either at the low point or at the high point. I can do 2-bit, which is 4 values, which is very steppy. So that's what we call quantization, right? It's very quantized. I can go to 4-bit, there's 16 values. You still see the quantization. And then in this case, if I use the entire range, I go to 8-bit with 256 different values. It's smooth. I can't even show the grid anymore, right? So that should be fine in this case, as long as I use the entire voltage range of the digitizer. We don't actually have control over the bit rate directly, right? So all of our digitizers, no matter what brand they are, including the ones that I'm not showing here, like National Instrument Boards, I'm guessing the industry standard is just that 16-bit. the 1401s and the Digidata boards are different in terms of dynamic range. This one has -5 to 5 volt. This one has -10 to 10 volt. All right, so total discrete values, 16-bit means 2 to the 16. So that entire voltage range, the dynamic range, is 65,536 discrete values that a signal can take, right? That means the resolution is, in this case, 10 volts divided by that because it's -5 to 5. In this case, 20 volts. So the resolution of the 1401 is twice as good. So in steps of 153 microvolts and in steps of 305 microvolts in this case. So if we think about the relevant signals that we want to measure, let's say we have a 1 millivolt signal. That 1 millivolt signal, I don't know, like an EPSP or something like that, right, would be represented in this case by only 7 values. And in this case, by only 3 values. So clearly that would be very, very crappy. But that's not actually what we're doing. Because we're using amplifiers, right? So we can amplify our voltage signals before we digitize it and use up a bigger range of, or a bigger portion of the dynamic range of that voltage range of our digitizers. So amplification really is key. To illustrate this, let's go back to the old man's face here. So clearly 2-bit is better than 1-bit because here you only have 2 different gray values and here you have 4 different gray values. But this one only has 4 different gray values because you use the entire available dynamic range, right? You actually used 4 different values from black to white. If you only use half of that range, even though you have a 2-bit picture, you may only get 2 different values out of it. So you're only using 50% of what 2-bit gives you. So that's not desirable. So you kind of want to make sure that your traces always take up as much of the dynamic range of the digitizer and basically are more discrete values than as you can, or as is reasonable or desirable. All right, let's look at the...
Dirk, before you
Yes.
go further, is this clear to everyone? I mean, the most experienced physiologists maybe, but you guys, the new one, you got it? Shakila?
Well, I don't understand how you could take up like 50% of the dynamic range and like if it's 2-bit, why is it?
Well, 2-bit just means that so let's say your camera, your digital camera, records 8-bit pictures, right?
Yeah.
Which means 256 different gray values from black to white. But if you take a picture of a gray wall, you're only using, in the extreme case, only one of those values.
Because
right?
the gray wall has one
8-bit
color.
just means that it allows you 256 different values, but that doesn't mean that you use those.
Okay.
So if you use
okay.
less contrast in the picture and nothing is black and nothing is white, it's still an 8-bit picture. Right? It's just not you only using a tiny bit of the dynamic range of what that bit coding allows you to do.
And then when you say we need our traces to take up as much of the dynamic range of the digitizer as possible, what does that mean?
So let's say you're using one of these 1401s, or no, you're using a digidata board, right? So the input range of that thing is -10 volt to +10 volt.
Yeah.
So you could record a trace that goes from -10 volt to +10 volt, and then you would actually use all 65,500 blah 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 values.
Yeah.
Right. But if I mean, nothing of what we record is ±10 volts, right? So if you use 10 millivolt, then that's only a thousandth of that range. So you only use a tiny bit of the range that we're actually talking about.
Okay. So and then like normally it's set up to a different value for the dynamic range, and
I come to that, what you actually have to do, right? All right.
Okay.
So let's look at an extracellular signal. So these these AM systems, extracellular amplifiers have 3 different gain settings, right? So you can amplify 100 times, 1,000 times, or 10,000 times. What does this mean? The smallest extracellular potentials, as they actually happen, are maybe like a microvolt. That's much smaller than anything that we see on the STG motor nerves. And the biggest one are about a millivolt. That's much bigger than anything that we see. But that's sort of like the extreme range what extracellular potentials can be like, right? So we have to map these signals on these dynamic ranges. In this bluish greenish here is the 5 to -5, the 10-volt range of the 1401. And then the digital range is twice that, right? Here, it's shown here in purple. Okay. So if we do this at 100 times, our 1 microvolt signal now becomes 100 microvolts, but the resolution here for the entire range is 153 volts. So our signal is actually still smaller than the resolution, and even smaller than the resolution for the digitator board. So you won't actually see a signal. It's just too small, right? It's not even at the scale where that is 2 voltage steps in the resolution that the digitizer has. Whereas even though the 1 millivolt signal that we've now blown up to 100 millivolt is only taking a little bit of the dynamic range of these digitizers, it's still that represented by 655 or 328 different values, right? So they look relatively smooth, so you won't see much, if any, quantization. So that's totally fine. You don't really have to worry about it. Okay? You look unconvinced, Shakila.
I don't know what
You don't know what?
Wait, you said you don't see much quantization?
Well,
I don't know what that is.
well, it's not steppy,
Oh,
right?
okay.
This looks like a smooth trace.
Okay.
Right. All right. So if we go to 1,000, then the 1 microvolt signal is now 1 millivolt, but it still only uses 7 different values. So now it looks very steppy still, or even just 3. So clearly that's not good enough for the small signal. The big signal is a lot bigger. So, I mean, that was fine even at 100 times, right? At 10,000, now we're getting somewhere. You see a little bit of quantization, like a little bit of steppiness here with the 66 values that you get for the small one and 33 if you use a digitizer, the digitator board. But it's fine. You see that it's a extracellular signal, right? That looks sort of okay-ish. And one thing to point out, though, is that the 1 millivolt signal here now is 10 volts, where you'd amplified it to 10 volts. And since it's not symmetric, you actually clip it with a 1401, right? So you actually go out of range of the digitizer. So you got to be careful not to do that, because then you lose that part of the signal. There's nothing to worry about for us, though, because all stomatogastric nerve spikes are substantially smaller than 1 millivolt and larger than 1 microvolt. So you never get clipping, and at 10,000, and you always get smooth representation of your extracellular spikes, right? Nelly, remind me, we have seen clipping even with a 10 to -10 range. I think, was it maybe the suction electrode recordings of the giant axons in the earthworm or something?
Yes.
I think something like this. So we definitely saw a signal that was bigger than a millivolt. So we blew it up to more than 10 volt basically, and then we got out of the range of these. But it's never going to happen to you when you do STG stuff. Right? So the extracellular thing, not a problem. Long story short, you just always leave it at 10,000. There's no reason to use 1,000 or 100 ever, and you're going to be fine. What about the intracellular ones, though? The intracellular amplifiers are funny because they have, you maybe call this unity gain or something. They're basically amplifiers that amplify signals 10 times as a generic settings. But the actual final gain, and it doesn't matter if it's the 2B or the 900A exoclamp amplifier here, the final gain depends on, depending on what signal you're measuring, actually the head stage gain, and then some output settings too. And that gets a little complicated. So let's start with a 2B first. Same logic for the 900A. Actually, why are we using two different types of head stages? So we do voltage recordings exclusively with our microelectrode 1, right? That is a head stage that has a head stage gain of 0.1. So it attenuates the total signal by a factor of 10. And then we do voltage recordings or current injections with our microelectrode 2. And that one has a gain of ×1. What's the point of this? It's a little complicated and they don't give you the right specification actually necessarily. But one thing to say is that the 0.1 head stage has a lower noise level than the ×1 head stage, at least for the old versions here. And the head stage gain also determines, how much current you can inject and what the output gain is. So this is actually from the newer one. I put it in the wrong slide, but it's basically this, right? So you have 0.1, 1, and 10x head stages, and they determine how much total current you can inject. 120 nanoamp wouldn't be enough for this, for all the stuff that we're doing, right? Because the sort of total potassium currents can be bigger than that. 1200 nanoamps would be fine though. I have one 10x head stage. I don't think we ever used it. I don't know if you could benefit from doing like big muscle fiber recordings or something that can actually inject 12 microamperes. This isn't entirely accurate here, but the output gain from these is, in current at least, is then changing inversely by a factor of 10, right? So the bigger the head stage gain, the less the scale of the current signal is that the amplifier puts out. And usually let's look at these output ports here. Most of you will use the ones that are in the front, but there are a couple more options. There's actually a rear panel that has a couple more options that I'm using here. So the logic is a little difficult, right? So there is an output that says 10 VM. That's recording the voltage signal. That's putting out the voltage signal from the microelectrode 1, right? The generic amplifier gain is 10, but it is called 10 VM because it has an output scale of 10. And then the head stage gain is 0.1. So it's 10 times 10 is 100 times 0.1 is 10. So the output gain is 10 millivolts per millivolt. For any millivolt that you measure that the cell is doing a change in, you get a signal that is 10 times as big, right? The same is true for the voltage signals from ME2, which is V2 here. Only, so it has the amplifier gain of 10, output scale of 1, head stage gain of 1, so nothing happens to this 10. It's also 10 millivolt per millivolt, right? Now it gets a little more complicated. Yes?
That's not true on the two Bs.
I can't
On
hear you. What?
V2, if I remember, it doesn't. Oh, you can't hear me?
Now I can.
Can anyone hear? Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Jorge, isn't the V2 putting out 1 millivolt per millivolt
In current, 1 millivolt per
on
nano,
2Bs?
but not in voltage. Is it?
No, on V2, on the 2Bs, it's just not scaling it by 10. On the 900s it is, but on the 2Bs it isn't.
Yeah, I didn't go back. Maybe that's wrong, but
yeah.
But it's that's sort of the logic, right?
Sure.
So, for the current outputs, I think in the 2B, Jorge didn't remember. I asked him. So on the back, there's actually two outputs. The generic one is the one that is repeated on the front that most of you are using, and that actually is 0.1, so it attenuates. So what this means is you have 10 times amplifier gain. It's a scaled output to 0.1, so it attenuates by a factor of 10, and then a head stage gain is 1. So it actually only puts out 1 millivolt per nanoamp, which is very little. I don't know what happens if you use I2. In the other amp, the logic is that the outputs are different depending on if you're on current clamp and voltage clamp. I think in this one not, but I don't know if there's differences in the noise level or anything like this. So Jorge didn't remember. I don't know. You could do that experiment and just record both at the same time and see if they're really only different by you know, that factor of 10.
No, there's difference in noise level on the two Bs, if that's what you're asking.
Between the attenuated output and the unattenuated?
Between the I2 and 0.1 I2,
Okay.
I2 has less noise,
Right.
but 0.1 I2 has a bigger range of these.
Yeah, so I mean, you can make that decision. For the other amplifier, the 900A, it's a little weirder. Again, we're using 0.1 head stage gain for ME1, 1 for ME2. And then we have this weird thing that there is the output is called scaled output that gives us the voltage traces, and it's the same logic, right? The voltage output is 10 times, so 10 millivolt per millivolt for both ME1 channel 1 and ME2 channel 2. Current is a little strange because if you switch to 2-electrode voltage clamp, then automatically the scaled output for channel 2 switches to current, and it has that same attenuation. So the output scale will be 0.1 here. So what it outputs is 1 millivolt per nanoamp. If you're in current clamp, then your current signal comes out of the port here that is actually called current output, and then that has a scale of 10. So there it's 10 millivolt per nanoamp. I don't know. Don't ask me why they did it like this, but that's the way it is. So let's look at this. Can we actually change that gain if we're not happy with it? Like the way we amplify to use as much of the dynamic range of the digitizer as we can. For the 2B, we can't directly at this level unless like you switch from I2 to the actual I2 output and not the 0.1 or something. But usually what you'd have to do is amplify externally, and the fancy method would be that you can't use because we only have one of those. You have a digitizer that has a variable input gain, right? Which is, we just bought one of those. But you're not going to use that because that's going to be a dedicated thing for dynamic clamp and things like that. What we have a ton of, though, are these DC amplifiers called the Brownlee Precision Model 410 here. Those amplifiers are completely overspecified for what we're using them for. So they have 4 channels, they have low-pass filters, and they have a huge number of different options for how much they amplify. One thing you have to be really careful about, and which is really annoying, that any external amplifier, you have to make sure that you know where the zero is. And if that doesn't matches the zero of the amplifier output, then you have an offset, right? So you have to double check if you crank up the amplification of your signal that you don't also voltage or current shifted in either the positive or negative direction. You have to correct for that. And it's, in my experience, is almost always the case that you have to do something there, which makes it really annoying and means that at least if you use a 2B, you only want to do that when you actually will really win something in terms of what your signal looks like. The 900As, and this is a funny story, neither Farzan and I really ever did continuous experiments with these because they're too new for that. We did use them in Woods Hole, and I did a little bit of that. And we both were, and Jorge too, I think, unaware of that you actually can change the gain internally. So I had built a rig with a 900A and a Brownlee on it, but it's completely unnecessary because if you go on the Axle Clamp Commander and go to the scaled output, at least, I don't think you can do this for the current output, but it has a gain here. So that allows you to put the gain to 2 times, 5 times, 10, 20, 50, 100, and so on, right? So let's say I'm in 2-electrode voltage clamp here. If the gain is 1, the output is defaults to 1 volt per microamp, which is the same as 1 millivolt per nanoamp, right? Which is what I just told you. You go to 5, for example, then it switches to 5 volt per microampere. So there is a way to very easily just scale your output signal, right? let's look at what this means. So let's look at a very small signal, let's say an EJP or something like that, a muscle synaptic potential. You sit at -60, so that you're that far away from the 60 millivolts, and then the signal only is a millivolt in amplitude. And then the biggest range that I could think of is when you're in 2 electrode voltage, or when you're in voltage clamp and you want to measure IH, let's say do something crazy, that you step all the way to -120 or -130 millivolt, right? So that's the biggest signal deviation from 0 that I could think of that we're ever going to do in terms of voltage recordings, right? So I mapped these 2 signals on onto a digitizer with a generic voltage amplification of ×10. You don't see anything at the scale for the small one, but it's still 66 values, so, or 33 values with a digitator board. So it's a little steppy, a little quantized, but it looks kind of fine-ish. I mean, it's not ideal, but you'd get away with it. And then you see a bit of the range that the that step protocol would take up. I could use an additional gain of 2 times, so I go to 20 millivolt per millivolt. Now this is 130 discrete values. It's less steppy. This is the 66 now. It's a little steppy. I can go to 5 times for the 1401. It looks really nice and smooth now. It's 326 values, but the step range, like for the IH protocol here, you would go out of range. You get clipping, right? So you exceed the dynamic range of this amplifier. Would still be fine for the digitator board because dynamic range, because the resolution is half, the dynamic range is twice of what the 1401 has. You go to 10 times, so you 100 millivolt per millivolt. You're completely out of range, even with a small signal here for the 1401. So you can't do that unless you use offset, which you don't want to do. You are still fine with the small signal here, but the large signal will go out of range for the digitator board. It's not that big of a problem. So if you, for example, use a 2B, do I need a Brownlee for my voltage traces when I have to deal with an annoying offset problem and things like that? You can probably, for most of the things that you want to do, you can probably get away with just not doing anything, right? Unless you're really interested in sub-millivolt precision of what you're measuring, which we sometimes do, but not all the time, right? All right. The current is the thing that I think we really need to worry about. So if I look at a 1 nanoamp, let's say EJC, so muscle or synaptic current, as the small signal that we measure, and then the biggest one I could think of was maybe a crazy large total outward current of several hundred nanoamps, right? The big ones are usually like 200, but 400 is probably a little more than anyone has ever seen. But just let's go there. Or what do you think, Holger? What's the biggest one?
VD has even bigger currents, close to a microamp sometimes.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Right. But it's sort of like this is the crazy
That's pretty big, yeah.
part of the scale, right?
Yes,
So if we do this, then since it only puts out generically 1 millivolt per nanoamp, this is not good enough, right? So you get this 1 nanoamp signal is only 7 different values. You can't even really recognize what the trajectory is, and only 3 values for the digitator board. So you shouldn't be doing this. You have to amplify. If you do 2 times, it's still only 13 or 7 values here. If you do 5 times, you kind of get in there. It still looks very quantized. You do 10 times, it gets much better, 66 and 33 values here. Still, there's no reason to stop. If you do 20 times, it gets nice here, but for the 1401, you'd get out of range, right? With really big stuff. Here you're still fine, but you get out of range later here, so it looks relatively smooth. You can go up all the way to 100. You clip the big signals, but that's sort of a very nice way to represent the small signals. Depends on what resolution you want, what size of the signal is, right? So I summarized all of this for the voltage recordings. If you use a 2B and you don't want to deal with that, just don't do it unless you really want to measure something small. there is no reason, if you use a 900A, not generically put the gain for anything where you know that your signals are not going beyond plus or minus 100 millivolt, not to just put the gain to 5. If you do anything beyond that, you can still put the gain to 2. And for the digidata board, it's the equivalent, you can go to 10 or 5, right? For the current, where it's more, if you measure something in the range of never exceeding plus minus 20 nanoamps, so it's maybe muscle synaptic currents that can summate and things like that, you can actually go to 200 or 500 additional gain here. If you know that you stay within the range of plus minus 100 nanoamp, you can go to 50 or 100. If you go anything beyond that, you should probably keep it to 10 or and 20. The current clamp currents have that default 10 gain of 10, but usually we use them for step currents, right? So you don't really care about quantization. It's just like you go to from one level to another. You don't really care about the details unless we're talking about dynamic clamp, where you may have to worry about this. But it's the 10 times. They come out at an amplification of 10 times anyway. So that's a very special case. But that's sort of the overall logic of it. What I should mention is that the reason why there's no reason to not do this is that there is no effect on file size, right? In the same way as if you take a 8-bit picture with a digital camera in the raw file format, it doesn't matter what's in that picture. The gray wall is the same file size as some landscape that has lots of dynamic ranges of gray values and things. So it only becomes important when you do compression. So if you put this up on your website as a JPEG, then the gray wall picture is a lot smaller than the sunlit landscape or something like that. But as far as I know, neither ABF nor SMRX uses any compression or cares about what's in the files. It's just a 16-bit is 16-bit, right? I think so.
Yeah. Can I add something? But you mentioned it, but remember also that the head stages have a similar issue, and they are designed in different forms. The 900A has that gain that Dirk indicated, but in the axle clamp, the 2A and B, you have different head stages with different amplification of the current, which is that H factor, right?
Wait, I explained all of that though.
You did, but
Farzan just said that I got it wrong, and that's actually anyway.
Okay, well, anyway, so but there are those two sides of the picture, right? So, and that has to do more with noise than with anything.
Yeah. So just to sum this up, this is going back to the recommendation for the sampling rates, which you also put in, right? So it's what I said earlier, basically. I just wanted to have some tables that you can refer to. Again, this one does have changing the sampling rate has a proportional effect on the file size, right? So you have to be careful there. But for the bit depth, it really doesn't. Setting the sampling parameters, and I think Shakila and Farzan just tested this yesterday. Even with the additional gain, if you use a 900A, the amplifier uses this Windows telegraphing system to talk to the digitizer because they're both made by the same company. You don't have to do anything. It gets all the scales right automatically. At least that's what Farzan told me yesterday.
No, well, we didn't test that telegraphing. I'm sorry. That's what you asked.
No,
But
you said if you set
can.
the additional gain, if you change it, then the voltage scale or current scale in P clamp is still correct. You don't have to tell it that you amplify 5 times or 20 times.
Yeah. So, okay.
Yeah. Right. But if you use something else, then you do have to change it. So in Spike 2, for example, for each of these channels, you put in a scale and voltage. And I don't have to go through detail, but it's basically if the amplification is just 1, it takes voltage values. If you want to have them in millivolt, it's times 1,000. If it's a 10 times already, then you just put in 100. So you have to scale things appropriately. And I put another table that makes it easier to do if you use this additional gain to see what the scales that you should put in there should be. But that's basically it. And yeah, happy digitizing. But I think, I mean, I've seen files from other people, and I think there were a lot of people who do not use ideal sampling settings for doing their recordings, either sampling rates that are a little lower than they should be, and not enough signal amplification for at least the current traces, which I think is very critical. So it's, you know, and so one thing I wanted to mention too, you have to keep in mind that if you do voltage clamp, it's not important what the size of the signal is that you're interested in, or it's not just important what that is, but it's the total current range that you have to go through to get it, because since most of the currents that we're measuring are difference currents, right? So you can't just say, I measure IMI, and IMA is whatever, like 1 nanoamp to 5 nanoamps or something like that, but you need to get it through that voltage range, and the total current may be, I don't know, 20 nanoamps or even 100 nanoamps if you haven't used any blockers or something like that. So that's the thing that you have to adjust to the dynamic range. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm making these, I have these tables, and we can sort of print them. And then
Well,
whenever
share the
PowerPoint, that's a nice
PDF
one.
of your file.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. I can do that too.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Perfect timing. All right. Bye, everybody. See you.
See you when I see you. How do I get out of